First of all, welcome. The first thing I'd like to say is we don't teach classes like this normally at CEU Business School. We don't have rows of people standing, staring at me and giving me the creeps. No disrespect. So this really isn't a master class. It's probably going to turn out into more of a horrible word lecture, which I don't like doing. We've only got 45 minutes, so a lot of the information on these slides, I'm not going to go into details. I'm just going to give you some broad brush ideas, because I'd actually like, if at all possible, to have questions, because I think that's probably a more interesting way of talking about this topic. Put your hand up if you've not been affected by the current economic crisis. Okay. One of my colleagues just raised her hand there. I think we have been affected. Okay. We haven't. All right. So that's a nice way to start our discussion, that basically almost everybody in this room has been impacted by this crisis. And, of course, what I'd like to do this evening is say a few things about why this crisis started. Some of us will be familiar with it, maybe not all of us. Then, what are the effects of the crisis? And I think we can split that into two separate kinds, primary and secondary effects. So, if you're an Anglo-Saxon company, you're probably suffering from the primary effects. If you're a German or a French or a Spanish or a Russian company, you're probably suffering from the secondary effects, and I'll come back to that. And then I think the stuff that I'm currently working on is trying to make some predictions about where we think this is going, and given those predictions, what we can do to survive and then hopefully prosper. Another quick question. How many of you have lived through an economic crisis such as this current one? Okay. Is anyone from Bulgaria in this room? Anyone from Ukraine? Has anyone lived through a currency crisis when the value of your currency collapses? Continuous uncertainty. One of those secondary effects that I'm going to talk about are currency crises, and I think this is a particular issue facing Central and East European countries. Before I do that, I just want to sort of give us some interesting quotes from leading economists. The OECD World Economic Outlook in June 2007 said, "The current economic situation is in many ways better than what we have experienced in years." June 2007. Our central forecast remains quite benign. A soft landing in the United States. What's a soft landing? Anyone tell me what a soft landing is? No guesses? It's when the economy slows down, but not dramatically. So, the growth rate drops down to the bottom of the cycle and then slowly rises again. A strong and sustained recovery in Europe. I think I missed that one. A solid trajectory in Japan. Well, I can't see that. And buoyant activity in China and India. Well, maybe that's true. When I was in Shanghai in October of last year, some of the managers I was talking to there were telling me that they were worried that economic growth was going to fall from 11% to just 8%. Can I borrow some of that growth for a few weeks, please? In line with recent trends, sustained growth in OECD economies would be underpinned by strong job creation and falling unemployment. But just 2 months later, the crisis begins. August the 9th, 2007. BNP Paribas closes 3 funds with strong subprime exposure. And that word subprime suddenly became part of our everyday vocabulary. I'm sure the guys at the back, you should have brought your telescopes. What I'll point out in this slide here is the blue line that is falling precipitously is the Dow Jones Industrial Index. So my pension in June 2007 was looking really good. I don't look at it these days because I'm a bit worried about if I do that I might throw myself off a building. And you can see that really the problems start from about August 2007, and it just gets worse and worse and worse as we discover this process which is called deleveraging. All right? Now, which was the first U.S. investment bank to go out of business? Lehman Brothers. Right? Does anyone know what the degree of leverage that Lehman had when they went out of business? They had 35 times their own capital borrowed. Right? A leverage of 35 to 1. Now, imagine going to a bank and asking for a mortgage where you borrow 35 times your income. Right? You'll probably get politely turned away. But that's what was happening to these large investment banks. And let's try and see why they got into this mess. Well, I think I've got 7 or 8 reasons. The first, of course, was at the time of the growth of this kind of leveraging was dramatically falling interest rates. Now, it was Alan Greenspan who pretty much kicked this off, the former head of the US Federal Reserve. By cutting interest rates continuously for a period of 26 months, it suddenly made the availability of debt much easier than it was in the past. And so many people that historically would not have qualified for that debt suddenly had access to that money. This is the so-called subprime mortgage. Right? It's people that you don't expect to pay the money back. Now, the current chief executive, and I say the current chief executive of Citigroup because you never know what's going to happen, right? The current chief executive says that the first principle of banking is you lend money to people who don't need it. All right? So subprime, as a concept, is the exact opposite. We lend money to people who probably can't repay. All right? So that's the first thing. Secondly, in the United States in particular, US Congress passes a series of laws which makes it easier to lend. All right? And we see a rapid growth in what we call disintermediation. Disintermediation is when the person borrowing the money is not talking directly to the person who's lending the money. All right? So the person doesn't go to the bank, they go to a mortgage broker. The mortgage broker gives them the mortgage and gets a commission from the bank for selling the product. Related to that, of course, are inadequate regulations. After the Great Depression in the 1930s, US Congress passed a law called the Glass-Steagall Act, which deliberately separated wholesale banking, corporate investment banking, from retail banking. This was repealed under the Clinton administration. So all of a sudden, the traditional boundaries between an investment bank and a retail bank blurred, and everybody was selling the same products. All right? Now, the difference in a retail bank and an investment bank is that a retail bank typically has lots of branches, a large number of clients with relatively small accounts, whereas an investment bank, of course, normally has smaller number of accounts with large amounts of money in each account. The Glass-Steagall Act begins to blur those kinds of differences. The fourth thing, which I will be the